My father stood beside my grandfather's coffin after 28 years of silence and asked me to sign away the only home I had ever known. I looked at the papers in his hand, then at the man who had left me on that farmhouse porch when I was 10. "Why now?" I asked. He didn't answer. "My name is Rebecca Hayes, and I grew up on a small farm outside Franklin, Tennessee, because my parents decided they had better things to do than raise me. The morning they left, my mother packed 3 dresses into a little suitcase and told me they were only going away for a while. I remember standing beside the old mailbox, watching their station wagon disappear down the gravel road. I waited until supper, then bedtime, then the next morning. They never returned. Grandpa didn't make excuses for them. He put biscuits and eggs on the table, poured coffee into his chipped mug, and said, "Eat while it's warm." That was how he loved me, quietly, consistently, without promises he couldn't keep. The farmhouse wasn't much to look at. The porch swing squeaked, the kitchen ceiling fan clicked, and rain came through one corner of the tin roof whenever a storm rolled in. But it was home. Grandpa taught me to balance a checkbook, change a tire, plant tomatoes, and never spend money I hadn't earned. On Sundays, we went to church and afterwards stopped at a little diner near the county courthouse. I had sweet tea. He had black coffee and pie. My parents never sent birthday cards. They didn't call it Christmas. Years later, I learned they had started another family in another state. They had a son named Michael, and apparently they had plenty of time for him. Grandpa never spoke badly about them. He only told me, "Folks show you who they are by what they do." When I was 30, I married Frank and started working at a medical office. I still came home to help Grandpa whenever he needed me. Then, one rainy evening, he called me into his study. He opened a desk drawer and handed me a sealed envelope with my name on it. "Don't open this until after I'm gone," he said. I frowned. "Why?" He looked toward the window. "Because if your parents ever come back, I want you to know exactly what to do." 3 years later, Grandpa died peacefully in his sleep. At his funeral, my parents finally returned, and my father wasn't carrying flowers. He was carrying a contract. I didn't take the contract from my father's hand. I looked at him for several seconds, trying to recognize the man I remembered from childhood. He had more gray in his hair now, but his expression was the same one I remembered whenever I asked too many questions. "What is this?" I asked. My mother stepped closer. "It's nothing complicated, Rebecca. Your grandfather left some property matters unfinished." I looked down at the folder. "Then why are you asking me to sign?" My father sighed. "Because you're the beneficiary." That word caught my attention. "Beneficiary of what?" He glanced at my mother before answering. "The farm." I almost laughed. "You haven't asked about me in 28 years. But suddenly you're concerned about Grandpa's farm." My mother's lips tightened. "That's unfair." I looked at her. "Is it?" Neither answered. I handed the contract back. "I'll have an attorney review it." My father's expression hardened. "You don't need an attorney." "Then you won't mind." I walked away before the conversation could become an argument. I had learned something from Grandpa. When someone rushes you to sign a document, slow down. The next morning, I called the attorney Grandpa had trusted, Margaret Bennett. Her office sat 2 blocks from the county courthouse, above a bakery that smelled like fresh bread. She was a small woman with silver hair and a habit of reading every page twice. I placed the contract on her desk. She studied it without speaking. Finally, she looked at me. "Did you sign this?" "No." "Good." She turned another page. "Did your parents explain what it does?" "They said it transfers the farm." Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly. "It does more than that." I leaned forward. She pointed to a paragraph near the bottom. The document would have transferred my interest in the property to my father, while also giving him control over several decisions concerning the land. "Why would Grandpa leave something like this?" I asked. Margaret closed the folder. "He didn't." I stared at her. "What?" She reached into a cabinet and pulled out another file. "Your grandfather created a trust. 3 years before he died." She placed it in front of me. "The farmhouse and the surrounding acreage were protected under that trust." I looked at her. "Then why does this contract say otherwise?" Margaret gave me a long look. "That's what we're going to find out." She opened the trust documents. Everything was carefully recorded. Dates, signatures, witnesses. Then, she showed me one handwritten instruction attached to the file. Grandpa's handwriting covered the page. Do not release the sealed letter unless Rebecca's parents attempt to claim the property. I felt my throat tighten. They already have, Margaret nodded. That's why you're finally allowed to read what your grandfather left you. Margaret placed the sealed envelope on her desk. I recognized Grandpa's handwriting immediately. For a few seconds, I couldn't bring myself to touch it. I had spent 28 years wondering why my parents had left me. Now I was holding the answer in my hands. I opened the envelope carefully. The first line made me stop. Rebecca, if you're reading this, your parents have come back for the farm. I read it twice. Margaret remained silent. Grandpa explained that my father had been drowning in debt before I was abandoned. He had asked Grandpa to sell part of the farm and give him the money. Grandpa refused. Then my parents asked him to transfer the property to my father. Again, he refused. Grandpa wrote that my father became furious and accused him of choosing land over his own family. My mother joined the argument. Then came the part I had never imagined. Grandpa wrote that my parents had decided leaving me with him would put pressure on him. They believed he wouldn't let his only grandchild grow up without security. They expected him to eventually surrender the farm to them. I stopped reading. My hands rested on the paper. For years I had wondered whether I had been too difficult as a child, whether my parents had been too young, whether they had simply forgotten how to come back. But they hadn't forgotten me. They had left me because they wanted something from Grandpa. Margaret quietly slid a box of tissues across the desk. I didn't take one. I kept reading. Grandpa had never wanted me to hate my parents. He had written, "Their choices were never your fault." Then, he explained why he created the trust. He knew my parents might return after his death and attempt to claim the farm. He wanted the property protected from anyone who might use my childhood abandonment against me. I lowered the letter. Did they know about the trust? I asked. Margaret shook her head. I don't believe so. Then why did they bring me that contract? Because they may not understand what your grandfather prepared. She opened another file. Inside were years of financial records. My father's name appeared repeatedly. Payments had been made from Grandpa's account toward debts I had never known existed. I stared at the amounts. He paid their bills? Margaret nodded. Some of them. My voice became quiet. Why? She looked at me. Because your grandfather was protecting you from consequences your parents had created. Looked down at the letter again. Then Margaret turned one more page. Rebecca, there's something else. Your grandfather left evidence that your father may have lied about why he left. You! My stomach tightened. What kind of evidence? Margaret reached for a second folder. A witness. The name on the folder was Walter Gaines. I knew him as Grandpa's neighbor. The man who had helped repair fences and bring firewood after winter storms. Margaret called him that afternoon. He arrived wearing a clean button-down shirt and carrying an old leather notebook. He sat across from me and removed his glasses. Your grandfather asked me once to remember what happened, he said. I leaned forward. What happened? Walter looked toward Margaret. She nodded. The argument, he said, between your grandfather and your father? Walter explained that he had been repairing a fence near the back pasture years ago when my father arrived at the farmhouse. Their voices carried across the property. My father demanded that Grandpa sell the farm and use the money to settle his debts. Grandpa refused. Then my father demanded that the land be put in his name. Again, Grandpa said no. Walter remembered my father shouting, "If you won't give me the farm, don't expect me to keep pretending this family works." I felt my stomach tighten. Did my mother hear that? I asked. Walter nodded slowly. She was there later. He told me my mother came outside after my father left. She had been holding my little suitcase. Walter remembered her telling Grandpa that they would leave me with him for a while. I stared at the table. She knew they weren't coming back? Walter's expression changed. I can't say what she intended, but your grandfather believed she knew. I didn't answer. Margaret placed Walter's signed statement beside the financial records. The evidence showed a pattern. My father had debts. Grandpa had refused to surrender the farm, and my parents had left me behind immediately afterward. Then they returned decades later with a contract demanding the very property Grandpa had protected. Will this be enough? I asked. Margaret shook her head. The documents already establish your legal rights. Walter's statement helps explain the circumstances. My parents challenged the trust anyway. Their attorney claimed Grandpa had been confused near the end of his life. Margaret produced medical records showing he had remained mentally competent. Then she produced the trust, signed witnesses, bank records, and her own notes from his meetings. At the county courthouse, I sat quietly while my father watched me from across the room. He looked older than he had at the funeral. His attorney argued that Grandpa had promised the farm to my parents. Margaret stood and asked one simple question: "Where is the evidence?" The attorney had none. Then Margaret placed Grandpa's final letter before the judge. My father stared at it. His face changed. He knew exactly what it was, and I realized he was afraid of what Grandpa had written next. My father stared at Grandpa's letter, as though the paper itself had become dangerous. Margaret read the final paragraph aloud. Grandpa had written that he had never promised the farm to my parents, never intended to leave them control of it, and had created the trust specifically to protect me from anyone who believed my childhood abandonment gave them a claim over my future. The judge reviewed the documents carefully. My father's attorney tried to argue that Grandpa had been influenced by me, but Margaret produced medical records, witness signatures, financial statements, and her own detailed notes from the meetings. One by one, every argument fell apart. The judge upheld the trust. The farmhouse and surrounding land remained protected for me. My parents walked out of the courthouse, without the property they had, returned to claim. Nobody applauded. Nobody celebrated. I simply walked down the courthouse steps with Margaret beside me, feeling the afternoon sun against my face. My father caught up with me near the parking lot. "Rebecca, wait." I stopped. He looked tired. "Your grandfather always hated me," he said. I shook my head. "He paid your debts." My father went silent. "He raised your daughter after you left her," I continued. "He protected you from losing everything, even when you weren't protecting me." My mother stood beside the truck, watching us. She finally said, "We thought you would understand." I looked at her. "Understand what?" She didn't answer. My father glanced toward the farmhouse. "We thought you owed us." I felt something inside me finally settle. "I don't owe you my home because you gave me away." Neither of them spoke again. They left Tennessee a few months later. I heard they sold their house to settle my father's remaining debts. I never celebrated that. Their consequences belonged to them. I repaired Grandpa's porch swing, replaced the leaning mailbox, and planted tomatoes beside the barn. On Sundays, I went to church, then sometimes stopped at the diner where Grandpa and I had shared coffee and sweet tea years ago. My children visited with their families, and my grandchildren ran through the same yard where I once waited for a station wagon that never returned. I kept Grandpa's letter in a wooden box beside our family photographs. His final instruction was still there. Never let the people who abandoned you decide what you deserve. I had spent years believing my parents left me with nothing. I finally understood they had left me with Grandpa. And Grandpa had given me something they could never take away. The courage to know that love is proven by who stays when staying costs something. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't what someone leaves behind. It is the wisdom they leave inside you.